We are the final panel, and of course, what do they say about being last? Always the best for last, no. So I wanted to, so I have to say, just fun and quickly, that I met Ben and Quinta, there's a reason why I'm saying this, by reading them, by learning from them in the national security space. And then I had the great luck of sort of not forcing them to write with me, but then ultimately so requiring it. So Alan, you're next up, buddy. Just saying, the same is true for you. So no, let me introduce the three of them. You allowed me to be silly, I know this, since we've been together all day. Ben is a fellow at Brookings and the editor-in-chief of the all-incredibly important, and as my husband says, saving democracy, thank goodness, explaining to us one indictment at a time, Lawfare blog. And Quinta is Lawfare's managing editor, and both of you have served as editorial board writers for the Washington Post. And Ben, I've heard said of you, you're a defrocked journalist. Do you say that about yourself, or you don't like when people say that?
No, so when Shane Harris calls me a defrocked journalist, okay, I never resist it.
You don't, right? On rational security.
It's not the way I describe myself.
Yeah.
But I don't push back when he says it.
Okay, so I shouldn't, what do they say, perpetuate a rational security?
It's fine. I have no problem being called a defrocked journalist.
Okay. And Alan Rozenshtein is now a visiting assistant professor at University of Minnesota Law School and an incoming assistant professor. Woohoo! We're so excited. Joining the full-time faculty of University of Minnesota School of Law and a brilliant scholar on national security. And that's what brings our group together. And so so Ben, I know you're starting us off to frame our conversation. And I'm going to let you take it over.
All right. So before I start, I just want to, first of all, thank Danielle for having us all here, and thank Meredith and the students who worked on this for making today happen and doing it in a way that has been such a pleasure to be a part of. So thank you all.
Yeah. And thank you, Microsoft, too. We haven't yet thanked Sue Glock, who can't be here today because she's not feeling well, but for funding the travel of our amazing and distinguished guests.
So speaking of people who aren't feeling well.
Oh, yes.
Notice
Bobby,
a quality segue there. When Bobby and the group of us were talking about this panel, he asked me to sort of connect some of the themes that we've been talking about today with the book that Gabby Bloom and I wrote, The Future of Violence. And I'm going to organize my thoughts a little bit right now around that. So the broad argument of that book is that, first of all, the technologies of violence that we associate with state actors are becoming so inexpensive at such a rapid rate that what is state capable today, this is a cross-platform observation, what is a state capable activity or not even a state level capability 10 years ago, a state level capability today will be in all of your hands 3 weeks from now. And that's a sort of a general pattern of development that, crosses biological violence, cyber, and all kinds of robotics, and all kinds of other issues that we haven't imagined yet. Deepfakes are kind of a good example of that, and it's one that the technology for did not exist at the time that we wrote the book, and all of which technologies, by the way, feel very pedestrian at this point. They seemed all very futuristic at the time. Now they seem very last month. This is a really good example of that, right? Right now, we can look at this and say, okay, well, what is it going to mean for states, and what's it going to mean for you? And There's another pattern that we identified, which is that states are really good at defending themselves at the end of the day. It takes a while, but they figure it out. And you are a lot less good at defending yourself. And so these technologies that we start out and we say, okay, these are going to be mechanisms of state-on-state violence, state-on-state action, end up being, devices by which individual people hurt and kill and wound each other. I think that's a reasonable set of expectations as you think about the application of these technologies at the state level versus at the individual level. So, all right, deep fakes, I think states are ultimately going to be fine. And here's why. They have really good public relations arms. So if you make, let's imagine a deep fake that 5, 10 years ago, any deep fake producer would want to make, which is Barack Obama announcing, yep, really am a Muslim and was born in Kenya, and I've been fooling everybody, and by the way, I'm calling on the world for jihad, right? Anybody who, like Jerome Corsi, would have made that deep fake if he could. And the President of the United States has a huge press operation. He has forensic capability to reveal it as a deep fake. And he has the loudest mouthpiece in the world to announce that it's fake. So those are some pretty good defensive tools. In addition, I think Kate's point from the last panel here is a really important one. And I want to amplify on it a little bit and expand it. So her point is that norms of trust develop, right? And we've all been trained that the video is the most, the camera doesn't lie. And so we've all internalized that at a psychological level. And so when you see video, you really intuitively believe that. The 10th time you see a deep fake and you learn that it was fake, your sense of what constitutes reality through video is going to change. I don't know how many times it's going to change before it's no different from seeing a photograph of somebody with a kind of weird neckline because it's a pasted-in thing. But just as we have developed a certain sophistication about improbabilistically accurate pictures, we're going to develop a certain sensitivity to improbabilistically accurate video. And so states are able to exploit that. There are also some technologies that will help in that regard. So it is already possible to, digitally sign things as a means of authentication. And at the point at which deepfakes become more pervasive, reputable news organizations will start digitally signing their video. And so if it's not signed by CNN and don't care if it has the little CNN logo on it, that will not be something that CNN stands behind. And so you put those various, and there's lots of other examples of that, but you put together the press operations and power of states to address information issues, the technological developments that have already exist and can be reasonably expected to exist, the forensic capability of states, and the normative development of different trust models than the ones we are working with now. And I think it is reasonable to say that in the long run, states will be okay. That leaves us a few little problems. One is the latency between now and when states are going to be reasonably okay. That is a big problem. In that period, we're going to see a big disinformation problem arising out of this. Now, how big? I don't know. How dangerous? The example that Danielle started with of, fake videos about, I liked the gradation between a Freddie Gray local video in Baltimore versus a Hamas incident in Gaza, right? I mean, those are, you can imagine both of those happening, both of those being pretty dramatic, having a real pretty dramatic events. It is also reasonable to expect that actors on the international stage who are pervasively engaged in disinformation will engage in this sort of disinformation. And that is true at the highly individualized, not sure what the right word for this is, so I'm just going to use the word individual asshole level. I was recently involved, actually, as was Quinta, in a, I'm not sure, it doesn't qualify as a deep fake, because it wasn't really deep. But, you know, I was at the opera, and all of a sudden my phone explodes with people saying I had tweeted stuff about accusing US troops of war crimes. And I had no idea where this was coming from. And so I texted Quinta something like, do you know anything about where this is coming from? And it turns out what had happened was that somebody had screenshotted a single tweet that I had sent, I don't know, years earlier, in the course of a dialogue in which I had been discussing in the thread why it is important that we have, that Bo Bergdahl not be able to escape court-martial for abandoning his unit. And I'd said, if you can't try him for this, then you also can't try people for, you know, and I listed a bunch of things, including war crimes. And so somebody in the sort of Pizzagate conspiracy world had tweeted this as evidence that I was accusing US troops of all kinds of war crimes. And, you know, so there's the individual level of this. If the person had had the ability to make a video of me saying it, I'm sure he would have. There's also the state level, you know, the Russians just changed some stuff, some stuff that Bob Mueller filed in the Concord management case. They will do this sort of thing. So you have a short-term disinformation problem that will have a long tail. I want to submit that the real problem, and I'm going to leave it here, is not at the state level or international politics or national security disinformation level. It's at the level, I had never heard the term last girl before today, but you know, Quinta and I have done a lot of work on sextortion over the last few years. And you know, the 15-year-old high school student who has a deep state, sorry, my worlds are colliding here, who has a deep fake video made of her and circulated around her high school, she lacks certain things that the President of the United States has access to in responding to it. So number one, she lacks a public relations staff whose job it is to go out there and explain to everybody that this is in fact fake. She lacks the forensic capability to prove that it's fake. And she also lacks the, and this is probably the most important aspect, it's like more important than either of the others, the comfort level with being ridiculed in public. So I have gotten comfortable with the idea that there's a world of people who hate me and they say all kinds of nasty things about me. 5 years ago, that really bothered me, right? And I am not a 15-year-old high school student. That's a learned set of emotional calluses. And the person who this happens to apropos of nothing, out of nowhere, is extremely vulnerable to it in a way that is much harder to protect against and will not necessarily be protected against by the watermark digital signature from CNN. One last thing. In the Department of Sextortion, a huge percentage of the problem, we haven't talked about sextortion today, but I'm going to sort of refer you to prior work on this. A huge percentage of the problem that gives rise to immense pain and suffering by a very large number of people is how people get the first picture of you, okay? And so the standard way to do it is either that the fancy people hack your accounts and take your pictures that you've taken of yourself, and then they send you a threatening note that says, I'm going to release this image of you if you don't send me video of you masturbating. The shocking number of people are vulnerable to that because of that one initial image. So my real fear of deepfakes is not what it can do to the national security of the United States or what violence it can produce that Hamas can generate or that a local community activist can generate. My real fear is that you don't need to trick somebody into delivering you that first image anymore. You can make it up.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts building on what Ben said. The first is that over the course of the day, it sort of came to me that I think the elephant in the room here is the president. He's appeared in multiple stages of dress and in multiple different forms. But what I mean here is that when Ben gives the example of creating a deep fake of Obama saying, actually, you're right, I was born in Kenya, and now I'm going to bomb North Korea or something like that, I personally, if I had seen that, would not have believed it because it just seems unbelievable. If you showed me a video of Donald Trump saying or doing basically anything, I would not immediately have that same instinct of this cannot possibly be the case. And what I mean there is that I think it's not a coincidence that we're talking about, that we're all concerned about deepfakes now, not just because the technology is at the stage that it is, but because if deepfakes are frightening because they seem to detach our experiential reality from the truth, the underlying reality that deepfakes are detaching from is itself bizarre and detached from reason. And that makes it even more alarming because it means that you don't have a good yardstick against which to measure these kinds of things. Kate pointed to the example of the confrontation on the mall with the Covington high school students. I think that's a good example. It became something that blew, everyone had an opinion on it because we're in a moment where something like that could be many different things to many different people because of how hyperpolarized and how deeply people are feeling things right now. So a deep fake is it's not as impossible to believe as it was before, and that means that I think we're at a stage where it's more concerning, and it also means that we put more value, I think, in saying, I've seen this and so I can believe it. I've heard this and so I can believe it. I don't think it's a coincidence that there's been a lot of conversation about, different forms of tapes proving things, whether in the Mueller investigation, tapes of the president saying various things, tapes that Michael Cohen may have made, tapes of Trump and James Comey, that there is this idea of the tape as something that will prove that it's real. That it is a recording, you can hear it with your own two ears. And what's disturbing about deepfakes then is that the tape as this kind of connection to reality, however bizarre and frightening that reality might be, is severed, and you can no longer even trust what you see or what you hear. So that's one point. The second point that I want to make, building off what Ben said and what Marianne said about the last girl, I think it's also not a coincidence that now is the moment where the tide really seems to have turned on CDA 230 and the way that people are thinking about regulating platforms and regulating the internet. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about today would have been heresy only a few years ago. But that doesn't mean that the problems that we're discussing, that we're trying to remedy potentially with these proposed solutions, are new. They've been around for a while. Danielle has been writing about them for years. I think what's new is that the way that people came to understand the role of the internet and the role of technology in the 2016 election was not as something that could, harm one particular person who is targeted with harassment, one person who's sextorted, but as something that posed a threat to the all of society as a system. And then it's no longer, oh, that wouldn't happen to me, because it did happen to all of us. Mm-hmm. And it's suddenly very apparent that this is something that we need to think about on a societal level. That said, I think that also means that there is a temptation to think about the threats that these things pose, as with deepfakes, in terms of that big scale, right? How is this going to foment violence? How is this going to create international conflicts? How is it going to be used by the Kremlin in a disinformation campaign? And all that is worth discussing. But as Ben and Marianne say, I do think if we focus too much on that sort of macro level, we risk losing track of the people who were hurt in the first place and who have been hurt all along and who are going to be hurt after states have figured out how to counteract this. And those are the people, often women, who are targeted with this kind of harassment. And so I do think that even as we're talking about this is a panel on deepfakes and national security, that it is important to keep going back to that individual harm.
Alan?
So I want to imagine what folks in the CIA and the NSA and FBI and the government are thinking about this. I have no inside knowledge whatsoever, but it strikes me that in many parts of the government, we're going to have a lot of really interesting discussions about how, if at all, the government itself should use deepfakes. So the first interesting question is, if I'm in the CIA and my job is to do some sort of covert action, covert mission to influence the politics of a foreign country, deepfakes are great. I can generate very authentic disinformation. It can be spread easily, and we know that this information and the techniques are not going to stay only in the private sector and the nonprofit sector. The government's obviously going to use them as well. And that raises a question of to what extent should the United States itself take advantage of this tool, of this technology. One thing that I think we learned from the 2016 election was that although the United States invented the internet, and although the United States has all the best tech companies and the best tech talent in Silicon Valley and all of this, the United States also seems uniquely bad at defending against cyber attacks. Not so much that it has technical problems defending against them, but that we as a society are not built to deal with these attacks very well. There's a great line, I don't remember who told it to me or if I read it somewhere, but the argument was with regard to cyber security and offensive cyber capabilities in particular, the United States has the biggest rocks, but the glassiest house. Right? I really like that. I really like that phrase, right? At the end of the day, we have the best hackers, the best technologists, the most impressive offensive firepower, right? And yet, we are uniquely vulnerable. And so, if I were in the government, I would ask myself, to what extent is this something that the United States government itself wants to take advantage of, right? Is this something we want to use as a tool in our arsenal? In that sense, it's no different than the argument presumably I hope someone had 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 5 years ago about things like Stuxnet, but other offensive operations the government had. And it nicely gets into the standard discussion about whether or not one can or should try to make norms against this sort of tool, and whether or not it is possible, right? One could make the argument that as useful as this tool is, let's say for the CIA and part of its operations, right, or for the offensive side of the government, it's not worth the validation that it gives that technique in the norms of spycraft. And so we should not engage in that. On the other hand, one might say, well, there's no way of, the norms are not actually useful in this regard. They actually don't have a lot of power to stop any kind of state behavior that is useful for states, and so we might as well take advantage of this tool while we can. So that's one way I think this will kind of play out interestingly in national security. The other way is almost the inverse of what Ben and Gabby have written about in books like The Future of Violence. So The Future of Violence, the idea is you have the democratization of violent capabilities. So individuals can wield techniques that were once the province of states. But the interesting thing about the internet is that it also does the opposite. It allows states to target individuals in other countries with greater ease and impunity. So we have a notion of a physical border. And so if some nation state wants to invade the University of Maryland Law School, they have to get through the border, right? And the border is not staffed by University of Maryland Law School police officers. It is staffed by the United States military. The internet, of course, doesn't work that way. Every computer is in some sense connected to every other computer. And so you have this interesting situation in which a state can directly attack an individual or an organization in some other country. And then when that individual responds, then you get a dynamic that I don't think we've seen before the digital age, which is of a battle being fought between a foreign nation state and a private citizen, while the private citizen's government itself is sort of sitting on the sidelines trying to figure out what to do. We saw this frequently in previous kinds of cyber attacks and cyber intrusions, where whether it was the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans would attack or hack some US company, and then it would be Google that ended up defending that US company. And you had this interesting situation where you had Google and the government of China in some sort of back and forth situation, right? Now, again, whether this is good or bad for national security is kind of an interesting question. On the one hand, again, I'm trying to imagine what folks in the government might think. To the extent that the US government loses control over conflicts with foreign nations, that's a serious problem. It's probably not, from someone's perspective, it's not a great idea for Google or someone else to be able to unilaterally kind of go at it with some foreign nation state. On the other hand, it can actually often be quite useful to essentially outsource responses to private actors for plausible deniability reasons and that sort of thing. So I think these 2 points, we can call them shallow truths about deep fakes.
That was a good one. Yeah.
That is about the reaction that I deserved for that comment. I'm ending strong. Always end strong. Is just thinking of deep fakes as another tool in the offensive arsenal of spycraft and thinking about how that will sort of play out.
So do we want to, we want to have a conversation is the sort of goal of this panel, but just in tying your comments together, I sort of sense, and maybe it's also tying the day together, this feeling of sort of disequilibrium. There were kind of like, and this, I guess, Quinta, you brought together beautifully, like this sense of we're just unnerved and trying to catch up both with our norms and law as teacher and norms as teacher, and how do we sort of get right ourselves so that we can defend ourselves? And is it, in thinking about, Alan, the offensive use of deep fakes, do you think, and this is just not based on, I'm not going to ask you to divulge anything for when you were at DOJ, right, I promise, but the sense that in another era, did we ever have a sense of queasiness about using tools, or is this special? Do we have any queasiness using them offensively, or might we, because of it's bound up in free expression values? And have we done this before? Have we had this before, whereas like that we have this queasiness about using tools that are disruptive? And do we think we're being queasy about them, whether it's the CIA? Are we using them offensively? Should we be? And I often think of like companies now stepping into the breach, whether it's Silicon Valley or elsewhere, to help protect norms that frankly the government should be doing. And isn't that the most frightening thing, frankly? Because they are, and I'm going to ascribe where Olivia's left us, but their commercial interests are at the bottom line. So I'm gonna, let's riff on what you all
I
say.
I guess I would start by, are there previous tools that we've been queasy about and it has taken a while to shake out whether we should use or not? Oh yeah, start with the submarine, right? Which there was a lengthy back and forth between the British and other countries about whether this was an inherently inappropriate weapon because it was, it didn't fight in the open, right? And there was this was, the German Navy and the British Navy, had many years of back and forth about this. So the idea that you have some disruptive offensive technology, by the way, the machine gun is another one where you just until people figured out armored vehicles, it accounts for just an immense disruption in the way people fought. So the idea that you develop weapons that are disruptive, the crossbow, of course, which is banned by the Pope in use again between Christian nations because it is, a horrible, horrible, evil thing, right? Until it's so useful that, of course, people use it. And so, the idea that there are these disruptive offensive technologies that emerge and we have queasiness about them and then, yes, we use them anyway because they work, is a general pattern. And there are these periods. Now, this is not a weapon, right? What is this? I don't know. It's a capacity. And it can be used offensively. It can be used for parody. It can be used to make, apparently, I learned this today from you, Danielle, it can be made to make people able to remember sexual gratification that they, in fact, can't engage in anymore in a fashion that I suppose we should consider heartwarming. Right? This is I wouldn't say it's a neutral technology because I can think of 1,000 horrible uses for it, and I've learned today of a few not so horrible ones. But that is not an unusual thing, that you have these developments and then you have to kind of figure out how to, and by the way, communications technologies have this quality too. The printing press, there was all of this anxiety about it for exactly this reason. This was going to proliferate the ability to publish things, and then, God forbid, people would learn how to read, and they would actually read the Bible, right? And then they might learn that there are different ways to interpret it. This was a deep sense of anxiety in Renaissance Europe, and so I don't think that's unusual, and I do think in that context, we always have a way of saying this new technology at its incipient stage will revolutionize everything, nothing will be the same, and we spin ourselves up into a lather about it, and usually it is modestly disruptive, and then we develop countermeasures, we develop sophistication about it, and the world is more similar than different. That is not the case with all of these technologies, the press being the most dramatic of them, where, the real world really was different afterwards. And the submarine was, the world was different after we had submarine-launched nuclear missiles than it was before.
So for me, the thing that is most potentially destabilizing, there are two things. I think one is the question, and this is sort of on what Quinta touched on, what it does to our underlying sense of reality, right? So Quinta made the point that I agree with, right? That the one problem, it's a little unfair to blame this all on deepfakes when the real concern is that the underlying reality is so crazy. The real problem is that we have a president who we could all imagine doing the sorts of things that could be deepfaked about him, not necessarily deepfakes themselves. So one potential destabilization that I see is what it does to the underlying sense of believability, right? If we get into a world in which we're constantly having our sense of truth undermined, and therefore we get to a world in which we are therefore more willing to believe anything, right? Then even imagine 10 years from now, when it's not Donald Trump as president, it's a mainline Democrat or Republican. Will we continue to be sort of epistemologically vulnerable to the sort of issues that deepfakes raise? The other thing for me, and this is kind of what I think is maybe the most interesting, is really what the role of platforms will be in defending against deepfakes. Obviously you don't need a platform to create a deepfake or to disseminate a deepfake, but if you want to do it at scale, it's going to go through Twitter or Facebook or Google or YouTube or whatnot, which means that inevitably Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Google will be called on to defend us or react to deepfakes in some way. And this is nothing new. We already expect Google and these other platforms to defend us against a variety of cyber threats and dangers. But what that means is that this question of the sovereign nature, as it were, of these platforms gets heightened. Now, when we talk, a lot of debates about whether or not we live in Facebookstan or, the Twitterverse, they get distorted because we think of, people say, okay, well, Weber defines sovereignty as having the legitimate monopoly of force in an area, and it's not like Google can come and arrest me, it's not like Twitter has guns, therefore I guess Google and Twitter aren't sovereign. And that's true, and that's true.
But it's because Weber never imagined the enforcement of terms of service.
Well,
it's the only reason he could have defined sovereignty that way.
Ben has many stories to tell about TOS.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly right? I mean, why do we care about sovereignty? We care about sovereignty because it's a mood, it's a set of normative views that we have towards particular institutions and organizations. That because they have a certain power that we care about, therefore we both recognize their legitimacy in certain respects, and we also demand certain things of them, participation, right respect, or whatnot. So if we now live in a world where we care as much, not just about physical protection, but of protection of our information, of our reputation, of our social lives, and that power to protect us is not, in fact, held by the government in the first instance, but it's held by these large companies, right? Then we will naturally, whether we think it's a good idea or not, start imbuing them with some measure of sovereignty, right? We see this already, for instance, with Facebook, I think most obviously, right? To the extent that Facebook increasingly governs our informational space, we both increasingly expect it to protect us, and therefore are willing often to let it do certain invasive things in order to protect us. And at the same time, we expect to have some sort of representation in that process. And that's why Facebook is, I think, just recently announced that it's going to start a Supreme Court of Appeals for, I don't know whether that nipple was artistic or not. So you similarly have a situation, I think, in which the extent to which these platforms will or will not take a prime role in defending us from deepfakes, among other kind of threats to our informational world, will actually determine how we treat them and how much legitimacy we give them, how much power we're willing to give them, and how much we expect of them over the next several decades.
Yeah, so what I've been thinking about for the last few days when I started trying to go over, seeing what new had been written in the news on deepfakes in advance of this conference was an interview that the Washington Post did with Scarlett Johansson, who had a deepfake made of her. And she gave this amazing quote, which is that the internet is a vast wormhole of darkness that eats itself. And I've been thinking about it over the last few days, and I think it is obviously evocative. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that it portrays the internet as something that is not only ungoverned, but in some fundamental way ungovernable, that it is something that cannot and will not fully be controlled. And I think that what Alan gets to is that there has really been a change in terms of not only what platforms are doing to regulate the activity that takes place on them, but what people feel they should be doing. And yet that never seems to be enough. So there's both this sort of cry of Twitter, Facebook, why won't you come in and protect me in the same way that you would call 911? And yet the way that I read these calls is also there's a little bit of a sense of panic of whatever these platforms do, it is never enough. And that may get back to what Ben is saying. For all I know, people had the same sense about, how things were going to turn out once people started using submarines regularly. But I do think it's complicated by this sort of, I don't know whether you would want to call it an erosion or a fracturing of sovereignty or something like that, but there's this additional edge to it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it reminds me that I left out the best weapons system development story that's relevant to this, which is that, we are actually, and I think Quinta's point is exactly right, we are really bad at anticipating what the technological developments are, how they're actually going to be used, and we get aspects of the story right, but we get sometimes the big picture right and all the details wrong, and sometimes we look into the future and we get it completely wrong. And my favorite example of that is in the 1890s, the Tsar of all Russias looked into the future and he saw the future, and he saw the technology that was going to destroy humanity. And the world actually, under his auspices, got together and had an international convention and banned it. And the United States is a signatory to that treaty. It's part of the 1897 original Hague Resolution, and it bans the use of hot air balloons to drop bombs. Because, this was, and yeah, so, and that is, we are still a signatory to what's called the Balloon Warfare Convention to this day. And that is why we use drones, we use tactical Tomahawk cruise missiles, right? We use fighter jets, but we do not drop bombs from hot air balloons. And if you think about it, I don't mean to make fun of the Tsar, because he got most of it right, right? He got right that this problem of aerial bombardment of civilians was, this produced tens of millions of deaths within the next few years. He just got the details of the technology wrong, right? There was a really great moral instinct there. He got it a little bit wrong. And the way you get it a little bit wrong makes it 120 years later an amusing joke at a conference, right? Rather than, he's not Francis Lieber, right? He's the guy who thought up the Balloon Warfare Convention, right? I think we should all keep in mind when we have a conference like this that takes an incipient technology and says, okay, what are the national security implications and what are we going to do about it? We are all Tsar Nicholas II, very likely. We're getting key aspects of the anticipation of it wrong. And to the extent we make policy on that, the policy is going to be loony in retrospect unless we're super lucky. And so, all of that is not to say we shouldn't be doing this, because we absolutely should be doing this. It's just we got to be humble when we do this.
Meredith, do we have time for questions? Because I think Kate has a question. Do we have time for questions? Okay. Kate, I'm going to get you that. No, no. Very loud.
So I actually wanted to prompt Marianne to respond to that, because I think that the hot air, with the hot air balloon, I kind of wanted. I think that Ben's point basically is responding in many ways to kind of what Marianne said to me, which was kind of which I thought was also a good, which is a really good argument, but that as I was thinking about it, I was kind of thinking that there was something to what you were saying, which is like in the absence of space. If we don't regulate, then things look where things end up. Things change and shift, and we get to this messy conclusion. And I was telling Ari at the break that I was kind of thinking that I was like, you could use that same argument to enshrine like a very traditional set of values, like, you know, that would kind of be very anti-progressive. So like, oh, like look how if we don't regulate, like, you know. Our TV will be full of non-traditional families, or something like that, like this type of idea that if you're not that you're kind of trying to lock things in time in a way that's not actually what we want to do. And so that's kind of, I thought Ben's point, my point, I'm just kind of interested, wanted to just kind of prompt Marianne's response, if that's okay. I know you're not on the panel right now.
She's
really,
always on the panel.
You're really smart, Marianne.
I want my new nickname to be Balloon Warfare Czar, because that's pretty exciting. Because in all seriousness, I think, you know, if they hadn't signed that convention, maybe we would have used a lot of balloons to drop a lot of bombs. So there's that. I mean, so in other words, you change it by, it's Heisenbergian, right? You change it by doing. So there's that question. But I also think it calls into mind that we have to be very careful about the values that we're trying to reflect, not the specific tools, right? So all legal drafters know this. Like, you try not to write the law for today, you try to write it for tomorrow. So don't say, for instance, with the deepfakes, don't write a law that says there should not be deepfake porn. That's a terrible way to write a law. You have to come up with a principle of, well, what is it that we actually think is socially unjust or is creating a social harm that warrants criminal punishment or legal intervention? And we have to get that articulation right. In the context of, say, revenge porn, so many laws are now written to say you shouldn't be able to distribute naked photos over the internet. That's a terrible way of writing the law. You need to think harder about what it is that you're trying to protect. Is it the non-consent? And if you do that, right, so we have pretty good examples for that, because now you have a principle that says there's private information that you have to get authorization to disclose. That doesn't go away in 50 years. It doesn't get outdated in 200 years. And I think there's something very similar here. And I think, you know, going back to this question of the last girl and what we could have done before now, because one way of having the conversation, as Aria said and others, is to say it's too late and the law needs to intervene. The other thing is, look at what the law could have done at a certain point. So we now can talk about Scarlett Johansson and the very realistic deepfakes that are made of her. But how long has it been the case that celebrities have been, you know, crudely photoshopped into porn basically ever since we've had the internet, and no one cared? And when these celebrities tried to say this is actually harming me, no one cared. What if we had cared? What if we'd actually said that when this happens to women and when women are objectified in this way and their reputations are tarnished, why don't we do something about that today? We wouldn't have a deepfake problem today. So I think that those are the moments where we really need to regret that we didn't take a step when we really could have if we were paying attention to the right groups of people.
All right, well, I thought, what did I say, moderator's prerogative, who I saw first. No? I saw you first.
All right, so I'd like to talk or push back a little bit on Alan's point about living in glass houses, or America as a glass house. So there's a very interesting story covered by the Baltimore Sun about the Freddie Gray protests about last year, where Twitter accounts appeared and they tried to recruit people to come out and protest. And they contacted media sources, and they contacted local civic leaders, and they tried to foment this kind of protest movement, all from a remote location. But what happened was Baltimore civil society, the city civil society, pushed back very quickly. They asked some pointed questions, and they undermined this quite effectively. And so to your point about using deepfakes or deepfakes being used to undermine certain aspects of American society, I think that American civil society is pretty strong, and that perhaps a defense would be to strengthen civil society. I'd like to get your opinion about that. And then as to using deep fakes in emerging markets or emerging democracies or authoritarian states as a weapon, most authoritarian states that I work in or that I'm familiar with, there's already such a deep distrust in anything that a deep fake would be, disregarded. It would just be more noise to be to add to the cacophony of theories where no one really knows the truth. So I'd like to get your reaction to those 2 points.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to what you say about American civil society, I mean, from your mouth to God's ears, I mean, I think it'd be great. And perhaps we will all wisen up and, this will all turn into something like the great moral panic of the 1990s that, Two Live Crew said dirty words in their rap music, and Tipper Gore got very upset about it, and we were okay. I don't know. It does strike me that we are really poorly positioned, and comparatively speaking, much more poorly positioned than other countries to deal with this problem, because we have, frankly, just for two reasons. One, we're an increasingly polarized society with few consensus institutions that we trust to give us truth. And two, our constitutional culture is one that actually doesn't, in some sense, believe in truth, right? Our First Amendment is kind of funny, is sort of funnily predicated on the idea that no one is allowed to say what's true and therefore to forbid lying, and hopefully in that process of the marketplace of ideas, the truth will somehow emerge. But that's just an empirical claim that it's not obvious is the case. And so, I'm heartened to hear that Baltimore civil society was resilient against this threat. I just wonder how ultimately how universal that really is for the rest of American civil society.
Can I just add to that bring back Mary Ann's earlier point, which she made in passing, that, we are talking about a modern technological manifestation of a phenomenon that is actually quite old. And we do have this, while we're talking about the acts of the Tsar, this incredible historical example of a deep fake, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which we know the history of, right? It was crafted by the Tsar's secret police. Anybody, and this is an interesting example because the fake is not that deep, right? Anybody who wants to who wants to know what this document is can know what this document is. It's not subtle. It's not an especially good. It's caused the murder of millions of people, and it continues to have this effect at 100 years after it was produced. It has a direct line relationship to the Dreyfus Affair. It has a direct line relationship to Nazi propaganda. It has a direct line relationship to propaganda now that goes on in certain radical Islamist spheres. So you can say, on the one hand, debunking it is really easy. Like, it was always nonsense. On the other hand, the fact that it is not true, by any meaning of the word true, doesn't actually reduce its power. And it remains a powerful document 100 years after it was created by an intelligence service for purposes of disinformation. And I think if you're thinking about like the real danger zone in state action in this regard, or in non-state action for that matter, this is where it lies, right? It's not that they're going to be able to produce the Ben Wittes video or the Kate Klonick video that you really can't figure out that it's not real, right? And that I'm saying something that I would never say, and I say, oh, it's bullshit, I never said any of that, it must be a fake, and there's just no way to tell whether I'm lying, that's not going to happen. What is going to happen is that for a certain group of people, you make that Kate Klonick video. Sorry, Kate, you're sitting across from me. You're my, you make that, and there's a group of people for whom it is politically useful over time for that to be true, and so it becomes true even though it isn't. And in an environment that gives rise to Alex Jones, that's, by the way, all of Alex Jones, right? That's actually what InfoWars is. It's even called InfoWars, right? You might as well call it disinformation, right? And so the danger is that this is a powerful tool in the hands of people for whom it is useful to convey things to people who want to believe them. And I think Marianne's point that that is not a new problem, it is a new technology for an old problem. The old problem has a history of being really dangerous.
So this goes, I think, most directly to what Ben was saying at first, but I'd love to hear what everyone thinks. I mean, even if states are very well equipped to be able to deal with this or will become, do you think that democracy is going to be well equipped to it? Because I mean, I think like if I was part of the Russian misinformation team, you know, fresh off a great run in 2016, gearing up to go again, I'm salivating at the idea of using this type of technology in the same way they did in 2016 with other information techniques, not just because I could have a very specific directed goal of pushing this type of narrative or combating that type of narrative, because it seems very valuable as a way of pulling down democratic structures in society. I mean, if not only can I use this to, say, push a false narrative, but if I can train American society or another democratic society to think that fake video is real, but probably even more damagingly have huge segments of the population naturally respond that, oh, I think a real video just must be fake. Can democratic society survive that if, you know, anytime you might have some sort of damaging video or, you know, just some sort of video that has very significant value to public discourse, that half the population can just kind of shrug it off and say they must be fake because it, you know, that would conflict with my pre-existing beliefs?
So you're asking exactly the right question, but you're stacking the deck in the way you ask it. So when you say, can democracy survive that? The answer is yes, right? I think the answer is, how corrosive is it, right? So this is going to sound funny, but I actually mean it totally seriously. So over the last few months, I don't know, it must be a few hundred young women all over the world, all wearing a shockingly small amount of clothing, have friended me on Facebook. And this comes as I am aware that there is an organization in St. Petersburg that is under indictment by Bob Mueller that and I just have this suspicion that a surprising number of these young women who send me these messages and just actually aren't, first of all, are wearing a lot more clothes than they are. And secondly, I suspect many of them aren't female, and many of them, and all of them don't look quite like the pictures that they're sending me. So here's the confession in that. It requires a certain amount of self-control not to engage any of them. Not because I don't know what's going on, but because we have certain programs that run in our head. One of them is that when somebody friends you on Facebook, that's because that person wants to know who you are. They want to attach themselves to you in some sense. The other is that we all respond to pretty people. And we do it whether we mean to or not. And so now I'm imagining that the deep fake is a very sophisticated example of that, right? It's less personally targeted to me. It's not an attempt to reach out and say, hey, do you want to be my friend? which is a very strange use of the word friend, by the way. But it is it taps a certain set of assumptions that we all make, and we're all programmed to make about when you see Ben Wittes saying certain things, saying something, you can assume that he said that, right? And we will need to unlearn some of those instincts, some of those behaviors, just as I have had to unlearn that when somebody friends me on Facebook, it's because somebody wants to be my friend, right? I've had to unlearn that. Now, I didn't know I was going to have to unlearn, but I did. And the degree to which we are unable to do that is the degree to which this is corrosive of democracy. It will be very different in different communities. You will all be more, as will I, be more vulnerable to the deep fake that happens to support your pre-existing assumptions than you will to the one that, as Quinta described earlier, you look at and you say, I just know that's not true. We will all have to unlearn the certain programmed instincts about how we respond to video, and that's what Kate was describing earlier.
I would say, I think what Ben says is right. I also think that part of what he's describing is putting ourselves, another way to say what he's describing is putting ourselves on guard in a way that we didn't have to be on guard before. Another way of describing that is being less trusting. I think because of the nature of deepfakes and some of the situations we've suggested here, that may also mean being less trusting of statements and videos that come from what previously I would have said would be the most trusted source, which is the government. I've had a lot of conversations recently with friends and colleagues who study Russia, and one of the things that they've said that I found really interesting is that the idea of, disinformation about the government, as the questioner was just saying, it's sort of not a big deal to many Russians because, of course, the government is lying, right? Why would you trust what they say? If you spin up a conspiracy theory, there are greater odds that maybe the government really did do X, Y, or Z. And I'm not saying that the US government would actually start behaving in a conspiratorial way, but I am saying that being on guard against this kind of manipulation requires being less trusting of an entity that I think part of being in a democratic society requires trust of that entity. It requires trust that it's going to keep you safe. It requires trust that it's going to maintain the modus vivendi between me and the people I disagree with. And so as we put up those barriers between us and the government and between, you and me, if I can't trust who you are online, that is something that we're going to have to think about in terms of what its effects on democracy are going to be, even as what I describe in one sense is protecting democracy from this kind of disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just answer really briefly. I mean, I think democracy will be fine. I'm not sure how well liberal democracy will do.
Yeah.
Just in the sense that deepfakes are yet another example of why we can't have nice things in the 20th century. Because as it turns out, our cognitive mechanisms are just not good enough. And it's not our fault. I mean, that's just how we were evolved. They're just not good enough to defend against the tools that we created. And so you have essentially two responses to that, right? One is you can have the government come in and say, okay, well, this is a threat like any other. We're going to go and solve this problem. We're going to aggressively combat deep fakes. We're going to force, everyone to get life logs, or we're going to deploy the NSA's technological infrastructure on detecting deep fakes. We're going to have like an official ministry of truth that will tell us what's real or not. And we're all laughing, right? Because that's not going to happen. And in part because we have this very strong First Amendment culture, and so we can't do what Europe likes to do, which is what's called militant democracy, where they say, look, we're all about speech, it's all great, but the moment you start using that speech to question democracy, they say, we're done, right? Because we went through this in the 30s, it wasn't great, we're not making that mistake again. We didn't go through that process, so we don't have it. Or we think, right? In fact, it seems to me that we actually have exactly like that. We just expect private companies to do it, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to have the exact, I think, same level of censorship and control and filtering, because again, we cannot have nice things. We cannot be trusted with this kind of fun 90s, 2000s peer production, the internet is going to fix everything freedom, right? But instead of having the government do it, we're going to have Facebook and Google do it, right? One thing that struck me is that folks, and I say this actually very much on the side of folks like Danielle and Marianne who are arguing for regulation through platforms, right, is that, you know, I think part of the reason we are more comfortable having this debate is because it's like, well, it's Facebook doing it. It's not like the government doing it, and that would be a bridge too far. But I think what we're going to see is, I think we're going to see a lot of we're going to see a version of censorship that is going to happen in European countries done by the state, but just in our country done by big platforms, which I think is probably a good thing.